carbohydrates. So that's just some examples of some common disaccharides. And then polysaccharides or complex carbohydrates, or sometimes we refer to them, these as the good carbs. Here, these are always referred to as bad. Okay. Bad and good. Okay. And we'll get into the reasons why here in a few minutes. But anyway, complex carbohydrates are called polysaccharides. So they are monomers, thousands of N can equal into the thousands. That means thousands of monomer thousands of monomer units make up a polymer. They're varying lengths, called polysaccharide. Here's two examples. This is starch and cellulose. Two examples. Whoops. Sorry, I'm going in the wrong way. So sorry. This is starch and this is cellulose. These are both considered plant carbohydrates. Starch is in the form, the way that the individual glucoses are linked together is different than the way the individual glucoses are linked together for the cellulose, and that's the difference. These polysaccharides are all polymers of glucose. The only difference between starch and cellulose is how they're linked together. So the way it's linked together in starch, it's called an alpha linkage, and the way geometrically it's linked together in cellulose is called a beta linkage, just to distinguish the two. But you can see the relative relationship of the carbon to carbon. It's down for the oxygen, back up for the carbon, down for the oxygen, back up for the carbon. Whereas for the beta linkage, it's a straight kind of on a diagonal, and the starch is going to be more in this, along this line, whereas this starch is along this line. Okay, and that difference in structure is very, very important. Cellulose, you know, is the material in plants that that is the structural part of plants. It's what gives plants their shape, like a tree trunk and the shape to the leaf and whatnot. It's the sort of, you know, like the bones and the muscle of the plant. It holds the plant, gives the plant structure. Starch is the food for the plant. It's how the plant stores food for itself. And as you are probably aware, the carbon in the starch, which is the food for the plants, originally comes from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? And then by the process of photosynthesis, the carbon is fixed into glucose molecules, and then they're linked together. And they're linked together either in the form of starch or cellulose. Starch is going to provide energy for the plant. Cellulose is going to provide the structure to the plant. Okay, so that's chemically the very simple difference between starch and cellulose. Okay, but it makes a big difference physiologically for non-plant mammals and animals. Animals that eat, you know, rely exclusively on grasses and leaves and whatnot for their food. They can't digest this beta linkage. And humans as well. Humans, plants, nobody can digest this beta linkage. We don't have the enzyme available to recognize this particular conformation of shape. We can only recognize this conformation of shape, this alpha linkage, and so we can break down starch. But the beta linkage, not so much. So the only types of creatures that can get nutrition from cellulose are creatures that have bacteria in their gut that can break down the cellulose. So it's only bacteria, certain bacteria, that can break down the cellulose. So, you know, goats and cows and koalas, other grazing animals, anything that just simply relies on grazing for food, giraffes, they all have several stomachs, and in those stomachs they're processing this cellulose with the help of bacteria. That's why those types of animals give off a lot of methane gas, because one of the products for breaking down the carbons is methane, because it's an anaerobic process, not an aerobic process. And so the bacteria is producing this methane, is producing the methane which actually contributes to global warming. All right. And you know, termites eat wood, which is cellulose also. But even termites have bacteria in their guts that help break it down. So even a termite can't break down the cellulose. It's actually the bacteria that reside in the termite that break down the bacteria. And termites, because of that bacteria and that anaerobic process, give off a lot of methane gas as well. Okay. So anyway, these is a couple of examples of complex carbohydrates. So when we talk about good carbs, we're talking about starch, and there's some of these starches and cellulose make up fiber. And so some fiber can be broken down, depends on, you know, how much cellulose type fiber you have versus just more complex carbohydrates. So anyway, it's good, and I'll tell you why in a minute. There's one more polysaccharide, though, that I want to tell you about first before I get to that, and that is glycogen. Glycogen is how mammals store glucose. So whereas plants store glucose in the form of starch for energy, animals store glucose in the form of the glycogen. Okay, and so the glycogen also has alpha linkages, and it's more branched, whereas the starch is more of a straight chain. The glycogen is more of a branched chain polymer, where you're forming linkages between the individual glucose units and on the number 6. This is the number one carbon, number 4 carbon, and this is the number 6 carbon. So 1, 4, 6. And so you can see that these are 1,4 linkages and those are 1,6, but they're all considered alpha linkages. So obviously mammals have the ability to break down the glycogen. Glycogen is stored, you know, when you have excess glucose in your bloodstream, first the glycogen stores are replenished, and glycogen is stored mostly in your liver. There's also glycogen in your muscles, but most of it is in your liver, and there's a little bit in your brain, because glucose, the monomer unit in glycogen, is blood sugar. That's the form that the simple sugar needs to be in order for the body to get energy out of that simple sugar. So all these different monosaccharides are chemically converted into glucose in the body by a variety of enzymes, and then it's stored, you know, as glycogen in the form of glucose, so that there's always a ready supply, because without glucose you can't survive for very long. All right, so there's all kinds of mechanisms to keep the glucose level constant in your bloodstream, and one of those is glycogen. We store it, so your liver is building up glycogen after you eat. And then once it's all filled up and the food has been completely digested, then your liver starts releasing glycogen back into your bloodstream, basically.